Hey everybody, welcome back to week 12, looking at the Crusades. So in the last video we talked about the background to the Crusades, in some ways what was going on before the time period of the Crusades. We talked about what was going on in the Islamic world and how that applies to why the Crusades sort of happened when they did. And we're going to sort of continue to pick up on that. So in this video, we're going to look at a few different things as it pertains to an overview of the Crusades. So first of all, we're going to talk about what the motives were, or at least some of them, for the Crusades, the Crusaders. Why was it that why was this the course of action, we might could say. And secondly, we're going to talk about just some general facts about the Crusades, just some basic information, defining some terminology and things like that. Then we're going to talk about the People's Crusade, which was really an unofficial crusade because of the person that called for it. And it's not necessarily, it's connected with the other crusades, but it's not deemed as sort of an official part of this series of military adventures. Then we talk about the First Crusade, which is probably the most notable. We're going to spend some time looking at that one in particular. We don't have time to look at all of them in particular, but we will note some of the other major crusades against the Islamic world at that time. And in connection with that, we'll talk about what the consequences of the Crusades were. And as we're going to see, there's going to be a number of those that ultimately shaped the history of Christianity, especially at that time. So with the motives for the Crusades, one of the first things that we talk about why the Crusades happened was this idea of pilgrimage. And again, the idea of Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. This is really a huge motive when we sort of look at why Christians saw the need to go visit the Holy Lands. And the Holy Lands, just again a reference to Palestine, Jerusalem, and cities in that area. So we know, we've talked about this before in the time of Constantine, right? That Constantine sort of, in a way, made Jerusalem and that area into what we might think of as sort of like a modern, sort of like an early form of a tourist industry to the city of Jerusalem. And over the course of time, certainly people visited those places, but obviously there's special significance held to those cities and places for Christians. And so that idea of visiting the, quote-unquote sacred sites, the sites that some deemed important and still do deem important to Christianity, that practice was certainly there. But we also want to keep in mind that for a lot of people, the idea of pilgrimage was tied into the atonement of sin. That is, you can have your sins forgiven. One of the ways in which you could do that is if you make a trip to some of these special sites. And generally, what was connected with that too was worshiping at those sites. And for some, that they would have their sins forgiven. With the beginning of the Crusades, there was a lot of times it wasn't labeled as a crusade. So like the first few Crusades, a lot of the terminology to define what the soldiers, what the people that were called Crusaders, what they were doing, a lot of that terminology was used in the context of pilgrimage. So some of these people that were going to fight the Muslim forces in Jerusalem would often refer to what they are doing as a pilgrimage in a way. And so there's a lot of connection, at least early on, between what the first Crusades were as it was connected to the idea of pilgrimage. And later on, it becomes a little bit more clear in terms of the separation of terminology between pilgrimage and crusades. But at least at the beginning, what some of these soldiers and really the forces of quote-unquote Christianity are doing here, a lot of times they were using the ideas of pilgrimage to talk about what they were going to accomplish by driving out the Muslim forces. Really, one thing that we'll point out is that the idea of pilgrimage, at least from the church and from church officials, was that, if you participated in these endeavors, these military endeavors, you would receive salvation in the form of the forgiveness of your sins. And as we've talked about before, this ties into the importance of what we mentioned a few weeks ago, talking about absolution, or the idea that in order to get true forgiveness of sins, you had to have the church specifically recognize it. And so this is one of the ways in which, the church would recognize your forgiveness of sins. You could have repented of your sins. You could have, done everything necessary according to the Bible without participating in this, but you might not have that public official recognition by the church of having your sins forgiven unless you went on a pilgrimage, or in this case, if you went on what would come to be known as the Crusades. So that's one important reason, the idea of pilgrimage and the connection of atonement for sin. Another important reason was that you had a lot of Christians fighting each other in Europe. And so naturally, you didn't have a lot of problem between Christian kings fighting other Christians. And so a lot of this stemmed over disputes about land, right? And certainly kings want to expand their territory, gain more land for their kingdoms. And so you have fighting over land. In some cases, you've got kings that are just trying to hold on to their thrones from civil wars. And so you've got fighting in that sense. This is also connected to the idea of knighthood. We think about knights in the medieval time period. You can sort of see there at the what's sort of faded out. That's intended to be on purpose, but you can make out the knights that are in the background there on the PowerPoint. Generally, nobles and sometimes kings had to hire out men to protect their land, and this is the origin of knights. These people these men that took up service to defend the territory of the wealthy people. And knighthood often presented the opportunity for upward mobility. Someone could begin as a knight, work most of his life defending a particular noble, and in the process he could become pretty wealthy in the process. And so that encouraged people maybe that are not from such a high social standing to become a knight and to try to gain wealth in that means. And so, obviously to serve as a knight, you got to have conflict, right? And so Christianity was not unaccustomed to violence at the time period in Europe. There was a series of statements known as the Peace of God that was passed by the Catholic Church, and it limited who the knights could fight. And it was one way in which to try to stem the amount of bloodshed at the time between people that are fighting over land, and because of this connection now between the church limiting the violence of the knighthood, there's a connection that develops between the idea of medieval knights and Christianity that becomes particularly prominent in the Crusades. So with the Crusades, though, if you're limiting that amount of bloodshed and you're trying to bring this system of knighthood under control, one thing that the Crusades would promise is that with the land that is conquered, perhaps those that make the trip over and are successful, that they will gain land in the process of that, gain land in the Middle East. Certainly the confiscation of Muslim land, the Muslim inhabitants in that area are not Christians, so really the papacy is not concerned about the bloodshed against Muslims. And so taking their land, Catholicism didn't really see any problem with that. And so this was an opportunity for people in Europe, maybe nobles that didn't have a lot of land. This is a way in which they could acquire a lot of land in the Middle East and hopefully stop a lot of this fighting between Christians in Europe. That was a goal, maybe we could say, for the church and for the papacy. There's also this idea of the Christian responsibility to fight for the weak. There are earlier actions where the Pope stepped in and called for military action to defend the weak. Pope Leo IV in 853 AD, you don't have to write this down in particular, but these are just a couple of examples. Pope Leo IV in 853 AD called for Frankish soldiers to come down to defend Rome from the Muslim forces that had just arrived in the southern portion of Italy. Later on, about 25 years later, Pope John VIII is one of the first instances in which a pope offered spiritual incentives to soldiers who would fight against the opponents of Christianity. And so this isn't the first time that the Pope has called on for military action against the opponents of Christianity, but certainly this is going to be to a much greater extent than ever before. And you also have this idea of just war theory, and it comes, generally people trace this back to Augustine. And just war theory is just the idea that there are some wars that are morally right to fight in, and that one is obligated to fight in. So when you apply that to what's going on in the Middle East at the time, you've got the opponents of Christianity that rule over these special places connected to the church. So if you fight for the cross, if you fight on the side of the Crusaders, you're really fighting on God's side. And so you think about, you might have seen images before of Crusaders with crosses on their shields or on their clothing, on the torso. And that stemmed from the fact of just war theory. If you're fighting for if the Pope is called for a crusade and you're fighting on the side of Christians in the crusade, you're fighting on God's side. So that's what makes it a just war. There's also the fact that the idea that those who lived under Muslim rule could not defend themselves because they had lost their land. So protecting the helpless is there. And in all of this, the papacy really doesn't get its hands dirty, doesn't really get its hands bloody, because it uses these soldiers to accomplish their goal through the Crusades. So those are just some motives for the Crusades. I recognize now I misspelled the word Christian there. That's not a good look, but I'll have to go back and fix that. So those are just some motives for it. Let's talk about some general information connected to the Crusades. All right, so let's talk about the words crusade and jihad. And we certainly have probably heard the word jihad in recent memory because of continued problems between the United States and the Middle East. In the past 20 years, you've probably heard this term on multiple occasions. Let's talk about what they mean. So the word crusade just would later come to be known as a military expedition against the opponents of Christianity. Again, the word itself was tied in very similar to the concept of pilgrimage, as we've talked about before. When it started to move away from just the idea of pilgrimage, the crusade sort of carried the meaning in a sense of what is called the way of the cross. And so generally the way of the cross at this point was a military expedition against those who opposed Christianity. And that was sort of the meaning of the word crusade. In a general sense, a crusade today just means a fervent war against an enemy. It doesn't necessarily have to be connected to Christianity. You can think about any type of physical battle or mental battle. Some people might use the term crusade to talk about the battle against a certain enemy. But it doesn't necessarily have to be connected to Christianity. So the word jihad just literally means struggle. And a lot of times we think about jihad, we think about holy war that is called by those of the Islamic faith against their opponents. The word itself can be used in a number of different ways. Let me back up there. So the word jihad, it can be used to describe, for instance, a believer's effort to follow the law of Allah or follow the Quran. So the idea of, if you're a follower of Islam, if you're a Muslim, and you're trying to live up to the standards of the Quran or what Allah has set for you, you might talk about that battle against sin as your jihad against against sin. And so it can mean an internal struggle against whatever keeps you from being loyal or being obedient to Allah. It can also be used in the sense of fighting against the opponents of Islam. Originally, there are a lot of rules connected to this, though. There are a couple that stand out. One is that that jihad can only be used in the idea of self-defense. There are other instances, and there are other qualifications connected to it that connect jihad with the policy that you cannot force conversion of Islam. Now, obviously, that's not there are exceptions to that, and obviously there are people that don't abide by that. But in a general sense, there are rules that are connected with jihad. You can't just. Sometimes we think about sometimes we look at the actions of terrorists and maybe we look at the actions of Al-Qaeda and terrorism that's connected to Islam and think that jihad's a very narrow, limited word, when in reality, in some ways, those terrorist groups sort of break rank with the true meaning, at least, of that definition. Because there are a lot of people, there are a lot of followers of Islam that see jihad in a lot different light than what Islamic terrorist groups see it as. And so that's important to note, right? So if you ever talk to somebody who is a Muslim of the Islamic faith, their concept of jihad may not necessarily be the same as is not going to be the same. Probably 95% of the time is the idea of jihad that certain Islamic terrorist groups have. So both of those words are important, though, because we hear them today. But in some cases, jihad was connected to the idea of fighting against the opponents of Islam. There were a number of crusades. Not all of them were against the Muslims. There were 9 that targeted the Middle East. We're not going to look at all of those. We will talk about some of them. Generally, they focused on Palestine, Constantinople, Egypt, those places right there around what some call the Holy Lands. There are several crusades that were launched against the opponents of the Pope. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But basically, these are heretical groups, people that taught things differently than the church. You also have the Reconquista in Spain, which that does target Islam, but it's in a different part of the world. You've also got several crusades that were caused against pagans or those that had not converted to Christianity in the Baltic area. And I believe we'll talk a little bit more about that in week 13. But that's just some general information. We'll look a little bit more in particular at a few of these events. All right, so the People's Crusade. This is generally not talked about a lot, but it was an unofficial crusade, not launched by the Catholic Church, but launched by a few other people. The participants in the People's Crusade were people that were on the lower rung of society, generally peasants, low-ranking knights, women, and children. Basically, many of those who did not participate in the official crusades. They are very unorganized as a result of this military training. They don't have a lot. Obviously, the participants there most of whom were not trained militarily. Some have speculated that the People's Crusade was in part a way to overcome the problem of economic poverty at the time. Maybe the idea of hope of a better land, we could say, if they're successful than what they have at home. The leader of this group of people was a man named Peter the Hermit, and as the term hermit suggests, he's not a very wealthy man. He was a preacher at the time. He went around to different cities and preached about the need of pilgrimage, preached about the need of the importance of those places in the Middle East. He generally dressed in very tattered clothing. certainly represented most of those who followed him. And one of the things that's characteristic both of the People's Crusade and really the Crusades in general is that sometimes there were certain phenomena in the sky that were connected to what people then perceived as God's approval to go and to take back the Holy Land. So I think there's a particular case of like a meteorite which fell towards the city of the Middle East. Some interpreted towards the Middle East. Some interpreted that as God's sign to go and to take those lands. Comets, eclipses, and things like that. People, just things that we understand what they are today, people then took those events to mean that this was God's approval to go out and do this. So the results for the People's Crusade, as you might could expect, if you got people that are not well trained and that are not capable of fighting, you can sort of guess what those results would be. One thing in particular we want to note, though, is the persecution of the Jews. And this is important because in some ways this, beforehand, the Jews throughout Europe were not necessarily treated as poorly. In some cases they were, sort of depended on the time, depended on the location. What happens with the Crusades is that you start to begin to see constant affliction of the Jews. And so, a lot of times we think about Germany in World War II, think about the Nazis, concentration camps, and things of that nature. And we sometimes we think of anti-Semitism or the hatred of the Jews. We associate it with Germany at that time, but in reality, there are centuries worth of history that show people in Europe not liking the Jews at all and persecution against the Jews. And this is one example of when it starts to become constant. So part of their motive, at least for some of these people, as they're going towards the Middle East, they come across several different cities where you've got a larger population of Jews along the Rhine River. And I want to pull that up just to give you a heads up of where that is. That map's not going to show it, but we'll see if I can. I'm going to test my geographic skills here and see if I can find it. But I believe the Rhine River is, I know it's right there within Germany. May not be able to see it on this map. But just know that it was, the cities on the Rhine, it's close to Germany. And for some people, there's some that speculate that maybe some of these groups some of these people that are a part of this that had come from England or certain parts of France that had not had a lot of contact with Judaism before, saw the wealth of some of these people that lived on the Rhine River, and it was associated with trade. And generally, if you're a merchant, you had a means of making a good bit of money. Some saw the wealth maybe of some of the Jews there, and they didn't take to that too kindly at all. Some Christians lumped the Jews in the same category as the Muslims, as the enemies of God, because the Jews were the ones that, in their mind, put to death the Son of God. And I think I've mentioned this before, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to hate the Jews for that. Obviously, Jesus himself was a Jew, but you also don't have salvation outside of Jesus' death. And so what happened was a lot of Jews, as they're making their way towards the Middle East, a lot of times they're persecuting the Jews. They're killing the Jews in the cities that they come to, and sometimes those Jews are being forced to convert. And this is something that's going to happen in the other Crusades as well. In general, the People's Crusades is very unsuccessful. Again, no military training. They're pretty much wiped out by the Seljuk Turks outside the city of Constantinople. And so they're not very successful in their task. But that's the People's Crusade. You have the official Crusades begins with the First Crusade, which is called forward in 1095 AD. 1095 AD. So Pope Urban II, who we talked about last time, he calls forth the Council of Clermont. And the situation again behind this is that the Byzantine emperor had come to the west to seek help in terms of keeping the Seljuk Turks from taking the city of Constantinople. Urban II recognizes this as a great opportunity to potentially heal the schism that had developed between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. This is also a way in which the papacy can grow their power as well. And so really what Pope Urban II does is, at the council, is he preaches a sermon about why Christians in the West need to respond and help the Byzantine Empire by driving out the Muslim forces in that area and in the Middle East. So Pope Urban II's sermon, the transcript of it was given later, so there is a little bit of speculation about whether or not these were the main topics of discussion, or was it altered after the Crusaders were victorious. Well, one of the things that he mentions in the sermon is, again, the idea of the just war. And really that the Pope, because he is the head of Christianity, at least on earth, he can call forth Christians from other different nations to assemble together to fight against the opponents of Christianity. So a lot of Crusaders, they wear the cross, so either on their shields or on their garments or something like that. They wear the cross. The Pope brings out that this is actually a war of liberation. This is not a war because of the losses that Christians have suffered, the fact that Christians had suffered the loss of land because of the Arab conquest, but rather he paints a picture of this is the opportunity for Christians to free those that are oppressed under Muslim rule in the Middle East. And again, as we connected with the motives, the church can offer, Pope Urban II clearly stated that the church can grant salvation to those who sacrifice in going over there and fighting against the Muslim forces. And so generally that's the content of this sermon. Pope Urban II not only preaches it there at that council, but he also tells other bishops that are assembled there to go and to preach that message wherever they work and in the cities that they work. So let's talk about the participants. So on the side of the Crusaders, the most prioritized group of people were the Frankish soldiers. Again, you think about the Franks, generally they were thought to be very powerful at this point militarily. Again, we think about Charlemagne, generally just a strong history of providing very powerful fighters. Urban II was a Frank. He was originally from France, so obviously maybe a certain sense of pride in where he came from could be given based on a lot of the soldiers being from that area. But in a general sense, even though they're prioritized, most Christians could participate. The head the head of the Pope's forces was a guy by the name of Bishop Adhemar. Bishop Adhemar. His name is Adhemar. Adhemar. He's the Pope's representative, so to speak. And so in that way, he's sort of, in a way, the head of the army. There are 4 major armies that are commissioned by the Pope. They each have a different function, different territory. Monks could not participate. So whereas most Christians could participate, monks were not expected to participate at all. They had to help out in non-violent means. Likewise, church officials could only participate if the bishop in their area or whoever the ruling figure was in their area gave them the permission to do so. And so, again, the idea probably behind that is, the common person goes and fights, but in a way that the church, to a degree, doesn't have to worry about getting its hands bloody because its officials, the monks, are not encouraged to fight. So the Crusaders, again, that sort of makes up who they are, right? They are a lot of times soldiers that are hired, but generally any Christian could participate in that. On the other side, generally the Muslim forces at this time, there are 2 major factions in the First Crusade. You've got the Seljuk Turks, as we've mentioned before. Again, they fought in Turkey and northern Syria. You also had the Fatimids, who we've talked about before, but again, they are the Shia Islamic Caliphate from Egypt, and at this point they control Jerusalem. So when the Crusaders come to the city of Jerusalem, it's not the Seljuk Turks that they're fighting, it's the Fatimids that they are fighting instead. So the results of the crusade, of the First Crusade, the Crusaders are, for the most part, victorious as a whole. They achieved victory at Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem. All three, Jerusalem obviously is very important, but Nicaea and Antioch were also very important. They are ancient centers of Christianity. One of the things that was also noted about this time was that the Crusaders supposedly discovered relics and some supernatural events. And the importance behind that is that both of those things inspire confidence in the armies of Christianity. One of the things about when the armies were called, they were called very quickly. And obviously you had some soldiers, you had some that are not as well trained as others. And so the whole circumstances behind that, quickly assembling an army, not enough time for provisions for the army. Generally, the odds would not have looked good right off the bat. But some of these, the discovery of some of these relics, some of these quote-unquote supernatural encounters gave confidence to a group of people that were sort of putting this military attack together bit by bit, we might say. So, like some supernatural events, for instance, there were reports of some soldiers that had saw Mary, a vision of Mary. Some saw a vision of Andrew. Mary, of course, being the mother of Jesus. Andrew, of course, at that time was very important to the Church of the East, and he was connected to that area. And so there were instances of people seeing these biblical figures as a way of encouraging them to continue on to take back some of these cities. There were several relics that were found. For instance, one was called the Holy Lance that was found in the city of Antioch. In fact, that actually gave, according to the account, the finding of that lance actually encouraged the Crusaders who were on the fence about launching and going forward and taking the city of Antioch. Finding that Holy Lance encouraged them to be the final push to take the city. The Holy Lance was an object that was the object that was thought to be the spear that pierced the side of Jesus while he was on the cross, where the blood and water came out. And it was said that if you acquired the Holy Lance, that means that you had complete immunity to injury. You could not die. There was another relic that was found that was stated to be a ball of Mary's hair that was found whenever she was at the cross and lamenting about her son's death. She tore her hair out, a ball of that hair remained, and that's what the Crusaders found. One of the more popular relics that was discovered was fragments of the cross that Jesus hung on, those wooden pieces. And these relics are obviously fake. We know that today to be fake, but what wasn't fake about it was the confidence that it gave the Crusaders to continue on with their mission. So in that sense, they're important, even though we understand them to be fake. Concerning the capture of Jerusalem, this is kind of interesting. So the Fatimids who were in Jerusalem, we often think about the Crusades as a battle between Christianity and Islam. The Fatimids in Jerusalem actually were, according to one Arab writer, were happy that the Christians had launched an attack on the Seljuk Turks, because the Fatimids and the Seljuk Turks didn't get along. Part of that is because of the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam. And so when this first happened, it was reported that the Fatimids in Jerusalem were happy that these Christian armies were taking and defeating the Seljuk Turks and taking land from them. So they weren't, you don't think about all the Muslim forces being unified at this point, as we've mentioned before. But the Crusaders eventually come to the city of Jerusalem, and the Fatimids recognize that, they're also under attack as well. They're a target as well. The Crusaders had essentially planned a long siege. The Fatimids had poisoned the wells around the city. This is, again, the idea of scorched earth. You destroy you destroy the land, you destroy the natural resources needed to survive in order to discourage the enemy from approaching forward. But eventually the Crusaders are motivated to take the city after there are rumors going around about a Fatimid army coming up from Egypt to defend, to sort of flank and attack the Crusaders who are on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And so the Crusaders, they take the city. It's reported that a lot of atrocities occur. So not just soldiers being killed, but women and children being killed. A very bloody event, thought to be. But at least the results from the outset was to protect the Holy Lands. In a lot of ways, they did that by the end of the First Crusade. They take back some of these important cities, including the city of Jerusalem, and try to make it a place that is a haven for Christians once again. So afterwards, the land is divided up. That conquered territory is divided up, and the territory is called the Crusader states. There are 4 different Crusader states, and I'll pull up a map of that in a minute. But an important thing that comes out of this is that many of these Crusaders, they don't get maybe the land that they thought they would, and so a lot of these soldiers return home after the fighting has ended. And what happens is that a lot of these territories are pretty lightly defended compared to the number of Muslim forces that are not that far away. And so you set in motion the opportunity for more wars to be fought later on, which is what happens with the other Crusades. So I'll pull up a map of the states of the Crusaders. So you can kind of see some of this territory, where the 4 main ones are, again, Tripoli, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and really it's these in particular that become the 4 important ones that are a result of the First Crusades. But again, they're lightly defended. You've still got significant presence of Islam right on the coast of North Africa to the east. So leaving it lightly defended opened the door for future war, which is indeed what happens. And so what we're going to do now is just sort of do a brief rundown of the other Crusades against Islam. So we have the Second Crusade. It was sort of in a way motivated by what had happened earlier. Again, the Crusaders who had taken the Holy Lands, primarily the Seljuk Turks, launch a counterattack. They take the city of Edessa, which was another city that had long been connected to Christianity. And the armies of the Crusades on the side of Christians that came to fight the Seljuk Turks, they're unsuccessful. They lose some land in the process. The Third Crusade marks the reign of one of the most famous leaders at this time, who is a man named Saladin, whose name is there on the screen. He at this point is ruling in the city of Egypt. He moves his armies out of Egypt. They take Jerusalem. At this time, there's a crusade that's led by the nations of Germany, France, and England, and they are ultimately going to be unsuccessful in taking back the city of Jerusalem, which is now fallen again into the hands of Muslim forces. I will say the Third Crusade, the Third Crusade, if you're familiar with the story of Robin Hood, generally this is the time period in which Robin Hood's a mythical character. He's a folktale hero, but this is generally the time in which Robin Hood would have lived, the time period of the Third Crusade. I bring that up just out of general interest you might have based on that. I think we've all heard the story of Robin Hood, but it was actually the King of England had gone to fight in the Crusades, and his brother, who is the villain, the tyrant in the story of Robin Hood, he takes over while his king is fighting in the Crusades, and it's Robin Hood who is fighting against the tyrannical brother of the king who has gone off to fight in the Third Crusade. So the Third Crusades is the time in which Robin Hood, the story of Robin Hood, would have taken place. The Fourth Crusade, it involved bribery. So the plan for the Fourth Crusade was to attack Saladin at his palace in Egypt, and that way maybe remove the major threat to retaking the Middle East. Well, there were other ideas involved. When they got to the city, I believe, of Venice, there was a call from the emperor in Constantinople to basically settle a dispute on the throne. Well, the Pope didn't necessarily, I don't think the Pope wanted to get involved within that, but the Venetians were bribed, and so the crusading armies were actually first sent to Constantinople to, actually the Pope did want to get involved. The crusading armies were bribed into going to Constantinople to put an ally of the Pope on the throne in Constantinople, which does happen. They're successful in that, but after that, the armies turn to go back to Egypt, which was the original plan, but they are unsuccessful. They're pretty much unsuccessful in what they've done. That moment where the Pope where the Pope tries to put his ally on the throne in Constantinople is actually going to further division between the East and the West. So whereas the First Crusade was an attempt to sort of unite East and West, the actions of what happens in the Fourth Crusade with a bribe here furthers this split between the East and West. You're going to have more crusades that follow, I believe 8 or 9 again in total, but they ultimately come to an end in 1270 AD. You've got another event. This is not happening in the Middle East, but again, this is happening in Spain. But you have, again, the Spanish Reconquista. And this all centered around the discovery of the tomb of James the Apostle. And this is not really his tomb, but there was a tradition that once James the Apostle died, that his body was actually taken to Spain and buried there. And so this is important because if you've got the tomb of an apostle, this becomes a major site of pilgrimage. And so if that's the case, then Islam needs to be driven out of Spain as well, so people can visit this site, and according to the idea of salvation, this is how they can have the forgiveness of sins, if they make the pilgrimage here. It takes a long time, again, for Islam to be driven out of Spain. Really, the Spanish Reconquista lasts from about 700 to 1492 AD. So over 700 years, it is basically the length in which it takes Christianity to drive out Islam. And it's actually the year that Christopher Columbus sets out and eventually discovers North America is the same year in which Islam is finally driven out of Spain. And that's what makes this interesting within talking about the Crusades as a whole, is that the only two places in which Christians were successful in driving out Muslim forces was in Spain and in Sicily. And today, Spain, and generally throughout history, but Spain and Sicily have been noted to be generally primarily Christian, right, and primarily Catholic. Using Christianity loosely, they're primarily Catholic. But you think about some of these other places like, the Middle East, you think about Egypt, North Africa, Turkey, some of those places where Christianity once existed, they still today remain primarily Islamic because of the failure of Christians to permanently drive them out of those places. So that's sort of a modern day importance of the Crusades. I know in Palestine we have the nation of Israel today, and we'll probably talk about the nation of Israel being established, when that happened in 1947, when it sort of gained official recognition. We'll talk about that in the final religious history class, but that's a little bit of an exception of a rule to that. But for the most part, the places where Christians were unsuccessful in driving out the Muslim forces are places that still today are centers of Islam. And so that's sort of a modern day connection back to this time period that I think is interesting to point out. Had they been successful in completely driving Islam out of Turkey, may very well be that the majority of the people in the nation of Turkey are Christian rather than Islam. And I think that's interesting to note. All right, so let's finally talk about some of the consequences of the Crusades. So most notably, the Pope's power increases. Again, you think about the entire process of it, right? It's the Pope that calls the shots for Christian military involvement, right? Whereas kings and nations had the power to call people within their own territories to war, there's really only one person who could call Christians from every kingdom to battle against the opponents of Christianity, and that was the Pope. So the Pope gains international authority that way. And we'll continue to talk about that more in week 13. You also have the fact that salvation at this point, in connection with the Crusades, requires one to be spiritually dependent on the church and to be spiritually dependent on the Pope. If you want to be forgiven of your sins by the church, you have to fight against the opponents of the church, really the opponents of the Pope. And so you have that spiritual dependency. At the same time, what the Pope does is that through his actions, he again creates more animosity between the Orthodox Church, the Islamic world, and Western Europe, which is primarily Catholic. And so the opportunities for the Pope to exercise that military authority by calling for crusades continues to grow, as long as there continues to be opponents of the church. You also see a byproduct of this, a renewal of piety and persecution. Piety in the sense of one of the things that develops because of the Crusades and especially the discovery of the relics that were associated with Christ's life is that there's more of a focus on the details of his life and especially the details of his crucifixion. So one example of this is the man that's listed there. His name's Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a writer. He wrote several books. He wrote several hymns as well that focused on the crucifixion of Jesus, and particularly a lot of times talked about tried to paint in the listener's mind an image of the type of things that Christ suffered. Maybe sort of in the same way when we think about, generally when people observe the Lord's Supper today, a lot of times we sing a psalm beforehand that sort of tries to get our mind to focus on the events of the cross, right? Well, there's a renewed interest in writing about things like that at the time. The relics as well that are found, they spread throughout Europe. So you could hear stories about a fragment of the cross showing up in England, or think about a movie example, right? You think about, if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, a lot of that movie is focused on finding the Holy Grail, which I believe turns up in, I can't remember the movie right offhand, but I believe the Holy Grail, supposedly the cup that Jesus drank out of at what's called the Last Supper, was found in Italy. And the reason it got there was, according to that movie, was that a man had taken that cup back during the Crusades. He had found it while he found it while fighting the Muslim forces in Palestine, and then had taken that back to his home. So that idea, the relics pervading throughout Europe, something else to focus on. There's also, because of the crusading spirit against the opponents of Christianity, there's a renewed focus on using violence to take out the opponents of the Catholic Church. One group, or two groups we'll note, are the Albigensians and the Waldensians. The Albigensians. They're called the Albigensians because a lot of their followers came from the city of Albi, which is in southern France. The ideas, though, behind Albigensian ideas or Albigensian doctrine was thought to have originated in the Byzantine Empire, but then made its way to this place. Well, they generally they believed that, sort of like we've heard before, there are two different gods in the Bible. The God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament. There was no physical manifestation of Christ, and there were some other things in which were very different than Catholicism. So in 1209, the Pope actually calls a crusade against the Albigensians. And so, again, the Crusades were not just limited to Islam. They were any opponent of Christianity or any opponent of the Catholic Church. And the Albigensians, because they taught things that were considered heresy, the Pope called for a crusade against them. And by 1350, they were completely wiped out for the most part. You also have another group that is also very interesting, called the Waldensians. It was led by a man named Peter Waldo, who was a merchant. Who gave away all of his property to become a preacher. We'll talk a little bit more about him in week 13. But they held some beliefs that were not considered to be appropriate with Catholicism, and some of these are very interesting. One of which is that the idea of relics are not holy, that they hold no spiritual significance. Another idea was that pilgrimage is worthless, that really, as they put it, that when you make a pilgrimage, you're just wasting your money, because you can't actually have salvation by you can't have the forgiveness of sins just by visiting these sites that are deemed holy. They also brought up the fact that when it came to holy water, there was nothing different between holy water and regular water. I don't have this up there, but they also held to the idea that it didn't matter where you prayed. You could pray in a barn, and it would be just as effective as praying inside a church building. And probably a lot of these things, some of us might, a lot of these things, a lot of us should agree with, right? Doesn't matter where you pray. Holy water, at the end of the day, is ineffective. There was also this idea that some connected the papacy or the Pope to the depiction of the Antichrist in the New Testament. And so some of these ideas are not going to go away, that the Waldensians produce. You'll see some of them continue to carry on later. And then finally, we'll talk about one of the consequences of the Crusades is that you've got the establishment of two monastic orders. One of which I think that most of us have heard of, a group of people called the Templars, or the Knights of the Temple. They took the same vows as other monks, the idea of remaining unmarried, in a general sense poverty, but they also were a violent group that were founded to defend Christianity. They were founded in 1118. They were originally supposed to be the protectors of Christianity in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. They become an organization together. They do become wealthy, generally through being given gifts for their work, and also they had a practice of loaning money, which again brought in money to the group. Later on, King Philip IV of France, the Templars become very unpopular. Apparently he had wound up owing them a lot of money because they had loaned it out to him, and he essentially accused the Templars of practicing witchcraft and a number of other teaching of a number of different things. Some connected them to Gnosticism, but they were essentially, they tried to eliminate the Templars, and for the most part they were eliminated. I know if you've seen, again, the Indiana Jones The Last Crusade, the knight there at the end that Indiana Jones meets, he's a Templar. The movie National Treasure, right? The Templars, the Knights of the Templar are very much connected in that movie to the plot of the story. which there's not any truth behind that, but in terms of those movies, if you've seen them, you probably have heard of the Knights of the Templar, or the Templar Knights. Then the other group was a group of people known as the Knights of St. John. They were founded a little bit afterward in the 1200s. They were primarily stationed in Jerusalem until Jerusalem completely fell to the hands of the Islamic forces. Later on, they settle on the island of Malta, which is in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Italy, and they actually stay in existence up until the time of Napoleon. So a good 5 to 600 years of existence for them. But these are two monastic orders that develop, but these monastic orders are unique now because they are designed to use violence to accomplish their goals, which is different than other monastic groups that had developed beforehand. With that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here. This concludes the content for week 12. Week 13, we talk about the aftermath of the Crusades, and a little bit at the same time how this is going to mark what some have called the golden age of Catholicism. And we'll note more about that in week 13, but thank you for your time and thank you for your attention.